1. The English sweating sickness, the ultimate speedrun disease. The historical vibe check. Getting sick in modern times means laying on the couch, streaming a show, and whining until someone brings you soup. But if you lived in England in 1485, getting sick meant experiencing a terrifying medical speedrun. Enter the English sweating sickness, or sudor anglicus if you want to sound fancy and Latin about it. This disease made its grand debut right at the end of the War of the Roses. Some historians think a bunch of French mercenaries brought it over, which feels like peak medieval Anglo-French relations. Thanks for helping us fight the king. Here's a mysterious plague that will delete your population. The symptoms, 0 to 100 real quick. Most historical plagues like to take their time. They linger. They give you a cough, a few spots, maybe a week to write your will. Not the sweat. The sweat was on a strict schedule. Hour 1. You feel a sudden crushing wave of existential dread and anxiety. Literally, a feeling of impending doom out of nowhere. Hour 2. Violent shivering, a pounding headache, and a massive fever. Hour 3 to 12. The main event. Your body turns into a literal human water park. You start sweating so profusely that clothes, bedsheets, and floors are utterly drenched. This triggers immediate, severe dehydration and an unquenchable thirst. Hour 24. Death. The death nap. One of the most terrifying elements was the extreme lethargy that hit near the end. Doctors explicitly warned families, do not let them fall asleep. If an infected person closed their eyes, their nervous system basically gave up, and they never woke up. If you somehow survived the first 24 hours, you were suddenly totally fine and immune. But with a 30 to 50% fatality rate, those 24 hours were a literal coin flip. The bizarre theories. Because this was the 15th century, the medical community had absolutely no idea what was happening. Theory A. Miasma. The streets of medieval London were undeniably stinky, filled with trash, open sewage, and questionable vibes. Naturally, doctors blamed corrupt air. Theory B. The stars. Famed physician John Caius, pronounced Keys, literally blamed astrology. He suggested that Mars and Saturn were having a bad day, causing an evil constellation that made everyone sweat to death. Because sure, planetary alignments are definitely why your pores are acting like a fire hydrant. The twist. Raiding the rich. Widespread diseases usually target the poor, the malnourished, and the overcrowded. But the English sweating sickness was a bit of a snob. It actively targeted wealthy, healthy, middle-aged men. It tore through the upper echelons of British society, claiming mayors, lords, and aristocrats. It even delayed the coronation of King Henry VII. The running theory today? The rich were the ones attending massive, crowded banquets in poorly ventilated, enclosed spaces, turning luxury dining halls into optimal transmission chambers. It vanished completely after 1551, leaving historians still scratching their heads. Was it a hantavirus? An ancient flu strain? We still don't know. To Cocoliztli, the real apocalypse of the Americas. The historical vibe. Check if you think the English sweating sickness sounds bad. Mexico's history looks at it and says, hold my pulque. In 1519, the Spanish arrived in the Aztec Empire. Along with their armor and horses, they brought an unintentional biological weapon, smallpox. Smallpox wiped out an estimated 8 million people, roughly a third of the population. But just 25 years later, in 1545, an indigenous disease emerged that made smallpox look like a mild case of the sniffles. The Aztecs called it Cocoliztli, which literally translates to pestilence in the Nahuatl language. It remains one of the deadliest demographic collapses in human history. The symptoms. Pure biological horror. Cocoliztli didn't just make people sick. It systematically dismantled the human body from the inside out in a matter of days. The onset. It started with an incredibly high fever, a splitting headache, and severe vertigo. The hemorrhagic stage. This is where it enters full horror movie territory. The virus caused the blood vessels to disintegrate. Victims began aggressively bleeding from every single orifice on their body. Eyes, ears, nose, mouth, and yes, every lower exit point you can think of. The end stage. This was accompanied by agonizing chest and abdominal pain, jaundice, turning the skin yellow, and massive painful black nodules under the skin. People suffered in absolute agony for about 4 to 5 days before their bodies simply ran out of blood or collapsed from organ failure. The devastation. The sheer scale of this epidemic is hard to comprehend. First wave, 1545 to 1548, 12 to 15 million, 80% of the native population. Second wave, 1576 to 1580, 2 to 2.5 million, 50% of the remaining population. In just a little over half a century, the native population of Mexico plummeted from roughly 22 million down to less than 2 million. Society completely ground to a halt. Fields couldn't be farmed, cities were abandoned, and the Spanish friars gave up on burying people individually, opting instead to dig massive trenches and toss bodies in by the hundreds. What actually caused it? For centuries, scientists argued over what Cocoliztli actually was. Was it measles? Was it Ebola? In 2018, scientists extracted DNA from the teeth of victims buried in a 1545 Cocoliztli cemetery. They discovered traces of Salmonella enterica, specifically the Paratifi C strain, which causes enteric fever, a cousin of typhoid. The climate trigger. The prevailing theory is that a catastrophic, years-long mega drought hit Mexico, starving the population and weakening their immune systems. When the rains finally returned, the torrential downpours caused rodent populations to explode and flooded the ruined water systems with infected waste, triggering a nationwide salmonella outbreak of apocalyptic proportions. 3. Kuru. The biological curse of the four people. The historical vibe check. For this next chapter, we are traveling to the highlands of Papua New Guinea in the 1940s and 50s. The four people had lived completely isolated from the outside world for centuries. When Australian explorers finally made contact, they discovered a tragic, terrifying mystery, an incurable, fatal disease that the locals called Kuru, which literally means to shake or to tremble. The outside world quickly dubbed it the Laughing Death because of one of its most eerie symptoms. The mechanics of a prion, zombie proteins. To understand Kuru, you have to understand a terrifying quirk of biology called a prion. You are made of proteins. They build your muscles, repair your cells, and keep you alive. But occasionally, a protein folds into a weird, mutated shape. This isn't a bacteria or a virus. It has no DNA. It's just a broken piece of data. When this misfolded protein touches a normal protein in your brain, it forces that protein to also misfold. It's a literal cellular zombie chain reaction. Slowly but surely, these prawns accumulate, killing off brain cells until your brain looks like a piece of Swiss cheese. The symptoms. The loss of self. Kuru had a bizarrely long incubation period. You could catch it and not show symptoms for 10, 20, or even 30 years, but once it woke up, the clock started ticking. Stage 1 ambulant. The victim loses coordination and balance. They get minor muscle tremors and a slight slurring of speech. Stage 2 sedentary. The victim can no longer walk without support. Tremors become severe. They experience drastic, wild mood swings, jumping from crippling anxiety to intense aggression. And then comes the signature symptom. Uncontrollable, involuntary, maniacal laughter caused by the neurological deterioration of the brain. Stage 3, terminal. Within a year, the victim is completely bedridden. They lose the ability to speak, think, or control their muscles. Crucially, they lose the ability to swallow, meaning if the disease didn't kill them, dehydration and malnutrition did. Priades of incubation, loss of balance, involuntary laughter, fatal muscle paralysis. The culinary culprit. Why was this only happening to the four people? The answer lay in their funeral rituals. When a loved one died, instead of burying them or letting them rot, the four practiced endocannibalism. Out of deep respect and love, they cooked and consumed the deceased family member to keep their spirit inside the community. But the demographics of the disease were incredibly lopsided. It overwhelmingly killed women and children. Why? Because of a strict cultural hierarchy. The men got first dibs on the muscle tissue, which rarely carried prions. The women and children were left with the remaining organs, specifically the brain, which was the absolute epicenter of the prion infection. Once public health officials convinced the four to halt the ritual practice in the late 1950s, Kuru completely disappeared. 4. The Dancing Plague of 1518, the ultimate lethal rave, the historical vibe check. We close our journey in July 1518 in the city of Strasbourg, which is now part of France, but was then a wealthy, bustling hub of the Holy Roman Empire. Most plagues involve people looking miserable in bed. This plague involved a woman stepping out into the middle of a dirt street, staring blankly into the distance, and absolutely throwing it down. Her name was Frau Trophia, and she started dancing. No music, no celebration, just aggressive, relentless dancing. The escalation, a very bad flash mob. At first, her neighbors thought she was just having an eccentric day, but then night fell, and she kept dancing. The next morning, still dancing. Her feet were bleeding, her muscles were screaming, but she physically could not stop. She danced for nearly a week straight until she collapsed from sheer exhaustion. Instead of being a warning to others, it acted like a beacon. Within a week, 34 other people joined her in the street, dancing like maniacs. By August, the crowd had grown to over 400 people. Imagine walking out of your house in the 16th century to buy some bread, and there are 400 people doing a silent, agonizing, hyperspeed marathon rave in the mud. The dead stare. Eyewitness accounts from city records note that these people weren't having fun. They had wide, empty, terrified expressions. They were screaming for help, begging for their bodies to stop, but their limbs were being puppeted by something outside their control. At its peak, the physical strain was so intense that up to 15 people were dying every single day from strokes, heart attacks, and heat stroke. The government's epic fail. The city officials of Strasbourg desperately needed to intervene. They called in local physicians who diagnosed the dancers with hot blood, a supposed chemical imbalance in the body. Their brilliant medical solution? They decided the dancers just needed to get it out of their system. People are dancing to death. Government solution: build a massive wooden dance stage, clear the marketplace, and hire professional musicians and bagpipers to provide a backing track. Result: it acted like gasoline on a campfire. Hundreds more caught the dancing bug. The scientific theories. What actually happened in Strasbourg? Modern historians and scientists are split between two major theories. Theory A: mass psychogenic illness. The year 1518 was an absolute nightmare for Strasbourg. The region was suffering from extreme poverty, massive crop failures, social unrest, and a syphilis outbreak. The sheer, unadulterated psychological stress of trying to survive may have triggered a mass hysterical reaction, causing a collective psychological break where people mirrored each other's erratic physical behavior. Theory B: the bad bread. Ergotism. Rye was a staple grain of medieval Europe. When rye gets damp, it can be infected by a fungus called ergot. Ergot contains alkaloid chemicals that are chemically similar to LSD. Eating contaminated ergot bread causes ergotism, which triggers severe muscle convulsions, intense hallucinations, and manic spasms. The city might have literally been experiencing a mass, involuntary bad acid trip. By September, the madness finally burned itself out. The surviving dancers were carted off to a nearby mountain shrine for spiritual cleansing, and the streets of Strasbourg fell quiet once again. Summary of historical madness. Whether it's sweating to death in 24 hours, bleeding from your eyes in Mexico, laughing yourself to sleep via zombie proteins, or throwing a lethal dance party in France, history proves that nature has an incredibly dark, deeply bizarre sense of humor. 5. Phossy jaw, the glow-in-the-dark matchstick horror. The historical vibe check. If you think working a modern 9-to-5 is soul-crushing, be glad you weren't a teenager in the 19th century. During the Industrial Revolution, one of the biggest booming businesses was the matchstick industry. To make matches strike, factories used a highly toxic chemical called white phosphorus. The workforce consisted almost entirely of desperately poor teenage girls and children, known as match girls, who spent 14 hours a day in poorly ventilated rooms, breathing in chemical fumes and literally eating their lunches with hands covered in phosphorus paste. The symptoms: a slow-motion rot. While the English sweating sickness was a 24-hour speed run, Phossy jaw was an agonizing multi-year marathon. The warning: it began with what felt like a standard annoying toothache and some mild swelling in the gums. The necrosis: the phosphorus fumes reacted with the bacteria in the mouth, causing the jawbone to literally die. The bone tissue began to rot away inside the patient's face. The ooze, foul-smelling, green-white pus would constantly drain from abscesses in the jaw. The odor was so profoundly putrid that victims were often completely ostracized by their families and communities long before the disease killed them. The nightlight effect. The absolute most terrifying and sci-fi element of this disease was that the phosphorus buildup in the bone was so dense, the victim's jawbones would literally glow a greenish-white color in the dark. If a match girl walked down a pitch-black alley at night, you could see her jaw glowing through her skin. The corporate greed. If the rotting bone reached the brain, it caused fatal seizures and organ failure. The only known cure: at the time was for a doctor to tie the patient down and surgically hack out the entire jawbone, leaving them permanently disfigured. The worst part? There was a perfectly safe alternative available called red phosphorus. But factory owners refused to switch because white phosphorus was a few pennies cheaper. It took the famous Match Girls strike of 1888, where thousands of women revolted against their horrific working conditions, and eventual government bans to finally put an end to the literal glowing horror. 6. Encephalitis lethargica, the real-life statue epidemic. The historical vibe check. Right around the time World War I was wrapping up and the Spanish flu was busy wiping out 50 million people, a silent, terrifying ninja of a disease quietly slipped into the global population. Between 1915 and 1926, an epidemic of encephalitis lethargica, literally inflammation of the brain that makes you lazy, swept the world. It affected over 1 million people, killed a third of them, and then did something even weirder. It completely vanished. The symptoms, trapped in time. This disease didn't bother making you sweat or bleed. Instead, it systematically turned off your nervous system's user interface. Phase 1. It started normally enough. A mild sore throat, a fever, and a headache. Phase 2, the lethargy set in. Patients would fall into a deep sleep, sometimes for days at a time. When they woke up, their eye muscles were often paralyzed. Phase 3, the living statue. This was the terminal, chronic phase. Patients fell into a state of total conscious paralysis called akinetic mutism. They became literal living statues. Total muscle paralysis. Imagine being 100% awake, fully aware of your surroundings, able to see and hear your family talking to you, but your brain is completely disconnected from your muscles. You cannot move a finger, speak a word, or blink on command. Some patients remain trapped inside their own frozen bodies for decades. The awakenings and the ghosting. In the late 1960s, a neurologist named Dr. Oliver Sacks discovered that injecting these statue patients with a new drug called L-Dopa, used for Parkinson's, caused them to suddenly wake up. People who had been frozen since 1920 suddenly started talking, walking, and laughing again, only to realize they had missed 40 years of human history. Tragically, the drug's effects wore off after a few weeks, and most slipped back into the freeze. To this day, modern medicine has absolutely no idea what caused it. Was it a delayed reaction to the Spanish flu? A rare mutant virus? An autoimmune attack triggered by a common bacterium? Because it vanished entirely in the late 1920s, it remains one of medical history's greatest unsolved ghost stories. 7. Milk sick. The invisible frontier poison. The historical vibe check. In the early 1800s, American pioneers were packing up their covered wagons and heading west into places like Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois. They cleared the forests, built log cabins, and started farming. But almost immediately, an invisible, unexplained assassin started picking them off. Entire families would drop dead within a week. It famously killed Abraham Lincoln's mother, Nancy Hanks, in 1818. The disease was so terrifying and unpredictable that entire frontier towns were completely abandoned, becoming ghost towns, because the pioneers believed the very dirt was cursed by witchcraft. They called it milk sick. The symptoms, the poisoned breath. The disease hit hard and fast, usually targeting entire households at the exact same time. The sick stomach. It began with extreme weakness, severe abdominal cramping, and relentless vomiting. The acetone breath. As the patient's liver and kidneys began to fail, their breath would develop a bizarre, intensely sweet, pungent odor that smelled exactly like acetone or rotting fruit. The coma. Violent muscle tremors would take over, followed by a rapid descent into a fatal coma. The unlikely detectives. For decades, doctors blamed miasma or toxic soil, but the answer was eventually found by an incredibly unlikely duo, a local frontier doctor named Dr. Anna Pierce Hobbs Bixby and a nameless medicine woman from the Shawnee tribe. The Shawnee woman pointed out a very specific, innocuous-looking wildflower growing in the shaded woods called white snake root. The chain of infection. What happens? Step 1. The plant, white snake root, grows in the shade. It contains a brutal, cumulative toxin called trematol. Step 2. The cow. Frontier cattle graze in the woods and eat the weed. The cows are large enough that they show zero symptoms. Step 3. The milk. The toxin heavily concentrates in the cow's milk and butter. Step 4. The human. The pioneers drink the fresh milk, unknowingly ingesting a concentrated dose of pure poison. Because the cows looked perfectly healthy, no one ever suspected the milk pail. Once Dr. Bixby and the local farmers started systematically destroying the white snakeroot plants in their pastures, the dreaded frontier curse vanished from American history. Summary of historical madness. The ultimate medical wrap-up. Whether it's sweating to death in an afternoon, throwing a fatal dance party, or literally glowing in the dark while your face rots away, history proves that biology has an incredibly dark, deeply chaotic sense of humor. Here is the final, definitive breakdown of the 7 times human history turned into a literal horror movie. Disease. The vibe. The culprit. The bizarre twist 1. The English sweating sickness, a terrifying 24-hour sweat speedrun. Unknown, possibly a hantavirus or rare ancient flu strain. Actively targeted wealthy, healthy, middle-aged men instead of the poor. 2. Cocoliztli, an apocalyptic hemorrhagic fever that cleared out blood vessels. Salmonella enterica, triggered by a severe megadrought. Wiped out up to 80% of Mexico's native population in just 3 years. 3. Kuru, a fatal neurodegenerative disorder causing tremors and mood swings. Prions, zombie proteins, hiding out in human neural tissue. Earned the name the Laughing Death due to bursts of maniacal, involuntary laughter. 4. The Dancing Plague of 1518. A silent, frantic street rave that lasted for 2 months. Mass psychogenic illness, stress break, or LSD-like ergot fungi in rye bread. Strasbourg officials tried to cure it by hiring bagpipers and building a dance stage. 5. Phossy jaw, a slow-motion bone rot affecting Industrial Revolution factory workers. Chronic exposure to toxic white phosphorus used to make matchsticks. The necrotic, rotting jawbone would literally glow a greenish-white color in the dark. 6. Encephalitis lethargica, a mysterious brain inflammation that put patients into a permanent freeze. Unknown, vanished in the late 1920s and remains completely unsolved. Left victims as conscious, living statues, fully awake but unable to move a muscle. 7. Milk sick, a sudden deadly frontier curse causing organ failure and chemical breath. Cows eating white snakeroot, concentrating a heavy toxin into their milk. Famously killed Abraham Lincoln's mother and caused entire pioneer towns to be abandoned. The takeaway: the next time you wake up with a mild cold, a stuffy nose, or a slight cough, just take a deep breath and be grateful. At least your pores aren't acting like a fire hydrant, your face isn't glowing in the dark, and you aren't accidentally doing the Macarena to your grave in the middle of a muddy 16th century street. Stay safe, wash your hands, and maybe think twice before ordering the brain salad.